There you are. Welcome back to part 2 of What is a Baby? A look at the history of abortion in medicine and law and how it relates to religion and politics today. First, a couple of announcements. Last video, I had a shout-out contest, and the winner is Lydia Bessie, who correctly identified the sweatshirt I was wearing as being a Viced Rhino sweatshirt. Second, I now have a Patreon page, and I have my first patron. Abe and Helen Lowen, please forgive me if I've mispronounced your name, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, are my first patron. And I now have end credits at the end of the video, and they are listed in the end credits. If you would like to become a patron of mine, please visit my Patreon page, become a supporter, and I will also list you in the credits as well. So, now with that out of the way, let's take a look at abortion in history and how it relates to today. Let's have a chat. A couple of interesting facts that I omitted in my last video. In the 1920s and 30s, surveys of educated women indicated that 23 to 35% of women said that they had had abortions. Dr. Frederick Taussig, a nationally recognized abortion statistician, estimates that 680,000 abortions were performed annually in the United States in the 1930s. Okay, moving on to the period of 1945 to 1960. This was the age of McCarthyism. Senator Joseph McCarthy initiated the Committee on Un-American Activities with the purpose of outing communists. Communism was seen as the greatest threat to the American way of life. People who were accused of being communists and brought before the committee had their careers ruined. Abortion was seen to be a communist idea because abortion was legal in the Soviet Union, and thus many doctors were accused of being communists because they performed abortions. The result was that abortion, although widely practiced and discreet, now became an industry that went underground. Abortion was something that was no longer practiced openly. There were raids on abortion clinics and on physicians' offices. Medical records were seized, doctors were arrested, women that were having abortions were arrested. This was a first, women being charged and punished for the crime of having an abortion or of wanting an abortion. It was not only seen as being communist, but also as being illegal. As these raids continued and it became more dangerous to practice abortion openly, services went underground, and services popped up that were not as reputable as the physicians that had been providing abortions. Now abortions were being provided by people who were not licensed in the medical field, but because it was an illegal practice, this was about the only way that a lot of people could get an abortion. A major case that had a profound effect on abortion was the arrest of Dr. Alec Bourne in England in 1938. Dr. Bourne performed an abortion on a 14-year-old rape victim and then demanded that he be arrested. Dr. Bourne was acquitted of performing a therapeutic abortion. He used this as a test case to prove that therapeutic abortion was just as necessary to preserve the mental health of a mother as it was to preserve the physical health of the mother. Dr. Bourne had behind him a social movement that supported him and brought about this result. However, the same case had the opposite effect in the United States. His case was widely publicized in Time, Newsweek, the New York Times, and the Journal of American Medicine. But because the social movement behind Dr. Bourne was not here in the United States, two doctors that were arrested around the same time period for the same crime did not have the same result. Physicians became afraid of practicing therapeutic abortion for fear of whether or not the courts would agree with them that a therapeutic abortion was needed. The result was hospitals setting up what they called abortion committees that would review cases to determine whether a therapeutic abortion was called for. These committees became widespread across the United States as a legal protection for the hospital. However, these committees were more about hospital policy than they were about patient care. One of the reasons that we see that this is the case is that these committees looked not only at the medical reasons for performing abortions, they also looked at the sexual practices of the women who were seeking an abortion in determining whether or not a therapeutic abortion was warranted. Several hospitals touted the success of their abortion committees by reporting how many fewer abortions that they were doing. Many hospitals reduced the number of therapeutic abortions that they performed by half or even 3 times over this period. What was the result? Some hospitals would only grant a woman a therapeutic abortion if she also agreed to sterilization. This was especially true of low-income women and women of color. As hospitals decreased the number of therapeutic abortions that they performed, saw an equal rise in the number of abortion complications that were coming in through the emergency room door. Entire wards were being dedicated to use by patients who were seeking medical care from abortion complications. In 1930, Cook County Hospital estimated that they saw 1,000 cases of abortion complications. Over the next 20 years, this number tripled, and by 1962, they estimate that they were seeing 5,000 cases annually of women coming in with abortion complications. Death by abortion was 4 times higher among women of color than it was among white people. In the 1920s, it is estimated that abortion complications were the cause of 14% of maternal mortality deaths. By the 1960s, this had increased to 42%. Abortion complications were clearly a serious public health problem, and a legal remedy was required. Physicians began to work with the American Law Institute. The American Law Institute develops model laws that can be passed by states so that there can be uniformity in what is legal from state to state. Developing an abortion legalization law was one of their projects in the 1960s. By 1972, 12 states had passed the model law. The only religious opposition to the movement to try to legalize abortion came from the Catholic Church. The Protestant Church was virtually silent. In fact, Reverend Dr. E. Spencer Parsons, Dean of the University of Chicago's chapel and a Baptist minister, organized a group called Chicago's Clergy Consultation Service on Problem Pregnancy. The purpose of the group was to try to help women obtain abortions outside of the state of Illinois, which had not passed the model law. Particularly, women who were of low income could not afford to travel out of state to obtain an abortion. It is estimated that by 1970, they had helped 7,500 women to obtain abortions outside of the state of Illinois. From 1971 to 1972, New York estimates that 65% of the abortions that were performed within that state were to women who were from out of state. Clearly, abortion was something that women were demanding as a medical need, and yet it could only be obtained in some places. And thus we came to 1973 in the dual cases of Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton. Roe v. Wade introduced the trimester system, saying that an abortion was legal in the first trimester of pregnancy. There were some limitations on abortion in the second trimester and the third trimester. In Doe v. Bolton, which accompanied Roe v. Wade, the hospital abortion committees were declared to be unconstitutional. These 2 cases have remained the law to today, although there have been some softening of them. The position of the Protestant Church following Roe v. Wade was virtually non-existent. There were a few pockets here and there of people who protested the decision, but for the most part, the church was silent. This changed in 1979 when Jerry Falwell organized the Moral Majority. The primary purpose of this group was to prevent Jimmy Carter from getting a second term as president. The Moral Majority needed an issue that would unite the group and get people behind them. They chose abortion as one of those issues. They convinced other religious leaders that abortion was murder. They did this by reinterpreting certain verses of the Bible. They're the same verses of the Bible that you hear most Christians today use to support the position that abortion is against God's law. These are as follows. First, Psalm 139, verses 13 to 16. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. Job 31:15. Did not he who made me in the womb make him? And did not one fashion us in the womb? And finally, Isaiah 44:2. Thus says the Lord who made you, who formed you from the womb, and who will help you. Fear not, O Jacob, my servant, Jeshurun, whom I have chosen. Despite these being used to make the claim that life begins in the womb, if you go to John Piper's Desiring God, he is of the position that God knew you even before the foundation of the world. Here's what John Piper has to say. Then at some point, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit decided to make history, literally. This point happened before the foundation of the world, Ephesians 1:4. And there you are, at the beginning. God knew you before there was a before, at a time when the Father loved the Son, and before the foundation of the world, John 17:24. If you are going to take the position that abortion is killing a human being because the Bible says that God knew you in the womb, then you have to also take the position that you were a human being and a living person before the foundation of the world, because, at least according to John Piper, the Bible also is of the position that God knew you at that time as well. And if God knowing you makes you a human, then I guess every egg inside every woman is a person. Okay, settled? I don't think so. A second reason that we should not take these verses to mean that God sees the unborn as persons in need of protection is that he didn't even bother to reveal that to people until 3,000 years after he wrote the verses. If the all-knowing, all-seeing God of the universe really intended for people to interpret these verses to mean that the unborn were in need of protection, he shouldn't have kept that information hidden from us for such a long time. What did Jesus have to say on the issue of abortion? Let's see now. He said, that's right, absolutely nothing. If this truly is an issue that was near and dear to God's heart, Jesus should have said something about it. But the Gospels are silent on the issue of abortion. And finally, since the verses that are used to support the idea that abortion is murder come from the Old Testament, these are Jewish writings as much as they are Christian writings. And what is the position of the Jewish faith on this? They say that life begins at birth. They define it a little bit more closely by saying that half of the body has to be born, or the head has to be born before a person exists. If the Jewish people, looking at the same verses, don't see a God telling them that life begins at conception, then there's no reason for us to believe that suddenly God believes life begins at conception just because a group of religious leaders didn't want Jimmy Carter to have a second term of presidency. So, what is a baby? This is a baby. And this. And this. And these. And you get the picture. This is not a baby. This is a zygote. It is a fertilized egg. It is a single cell that is the union of a sperm and an egg. And this is another zygote. It is two cells. This cell will travel through the fallopian tube and into the uterus, and it's possible it could become a person, but most likely it won't. Why is that? The chances of implantation of a fertilized egg at somewhere between 30 and 50%. 50% being the highest. I even found one website that said that it is now well established that 2/3 of all fertilized eggs are expelled from the uterus without ever implanting. If all fertilized eggs are human beings, then human beings are dying at a rate that we never dreamed possible, because 2/3 of them are being expelled from the uterus without ever implanting. And this is why the morning after pill absolutely should not be considered a form of abortion. It is a form of birth control. It only helps nature take its course. It allows for a fertilized egg to be expelled from the uterus, something that most likely would have occurred even without taking the pill. So the zygote travels along the uterus, it becomes an embryo, it implants, and over the next couple of weeks it eventually becomes a fetus. The fetus slowly develops, and at some point the fetus becomes viable. This is when things get rather difficult. The real question isn't what is a baby. The question should be what is a person. And clearly a zygote is not a person. But is a viable fetus a person? That's a question that I'm going to leave up to another day. A second inconsistency of the religious community on the issue of abortion comes with the treatment of embryos. Embryos, according to the majority of Christians, are human beings. Part of the in vitro fertilization process is to create hundreds of embryos, only a few of which are ever inserted into a woman for implantation, and even a much smaller number ever develop into a human being. Most of the embryos at in vitro fertilization clinics are disposed of or used for other purposes. If you truly believe that an embryo is a human being, then you should be just as against in vitro fertilization as you are against abortion. They both do the same thing. 66% of abortions occur within the first 8 weeks of pregnancy, while it is still in the embryo stage. The embryo becomes a fetus at the 8th week. 92% of all abortions occur within the first 13 weeks of pregnancy. Only a little over 1% of all abortions are done in the final trimester. But why are late-term abortions done? First of all, as I was making this video, I started thinking about my own personal experience. Have I ever had an abortion? No, I don't think I have, but arguably someone could say that I did. In 1984, at 30 weeks of gestation, I had a child die in utero. I carried that fetus dead for 3 weeks before I finally gave birth to it. 5 days before I gave birth, my water broke. I went into the hospital, they examined me, they saw that I was not in labor, and they told me to go home. I asked if they thought possibly my water broke, and they said yes, that was a possibility, but they still sent me home. 5 days later, I went into labor, but the labor only lasted for about 2 hours, and it quit. I called the hospital, and they finally told me to go ahead and come in, and they would induce labor for me. What I delivered was a stillborn baby that had died at 30 weeks of gestation, but I had now been carrying it for 33 weeks. According to the autopsy report, it was a severely emaciated female. I was carrying a decomposing body within my body for 3 weeks. This endangered my life. I should have terminated this pregnancy earlier, but unfortunately I wasn't aware of the dangers to my own health from carrying a dead baby. The psychological harm that this caused me was great as well. A lot of people take liberties with women that are obviously pregnant. When people see that you are clearly pregnant, they'll come up and they'll pat your belly and ask you when you're due with a big smile on their face because they think it's such an exciting and happy time. And most of the time it is, but not always. And when I would tell people it's dead, that was the end of the conversation. It was a very difficult thing to do, and I finally concluded that the only thing I really could do to be comfortable was to seclude myself inside my house and not go anywhere until I had this baby outside of me. So I eventually did have labor induced. Was that an abortion? Because I terminated the pregnancy, even though the baby was already dead. Another difficult question is a friend of mine, her circumstances. 1 month before she gave birth, a ultrasound determined that her baby had no central brain line division. A baby in this condition does not have any chance of survival. She did give birth to a live baby. The baby lived for a few hours before it died. Should she have been allowed to terminate the pregnancy and not have to live through carrying a baby that she knows is going to die soon? Does she have to face all the smiling people that come up and pat her belly and ask her when she's due, knowing the baby that she's about to give birth to isn't going to live? These are difficult questions, and we can't shrug them off just by saying, well, it's a person, you have to carry it to term. A number of states have been passing legislation trying to make abortion more difficult, if not impossible. Recently, Ohio passed a bill saying that ectopic pregnancies had to be reimplanted in the womb, despite the fact that we do not have the technology to do this. Clearly, the legislature cares far more for these unborn embryos than they are for the health of the women who have to undergo this procedure. My own home state of Alabama passed a bill making abortion virtually illegal, even in the cases of rape and incest. This bill would have gone into effect just a few months ago, but it was stayed by a court. The Daily Show came up with a humorous way to deal with this issue by appealing to something that conservatives are very much in favor of: corporations. Their idea was for a woman to incorporate her female parts so that it would no longer be subject to legislation.
Regulating your vagina.
But it's a business now.
Well, in that case, here's a tax cut.
But seriously, one of the biggest problems with the abortion issue, people who are against abortion look only at the fetus, and they do not look at the lives of the women who are affected by the pregnancy. In one museum where they were showing the development of the fetus is shown inside of a transparent mannequin. And that is so typical of what is going on with looking at the abortion issue. People are looking only at the fetus, and the women are invisible. I would like to conclude this with a couple of paragraphs from Leslie Reagan's book, talking about what would happen if we try to turn back the clock and make abortion illegal again. She says, "If Roe v. Wade were to be overturned and abortion made illegal again, the history of when abortion was a crime suggests that the results would be dire indeed. The practice of abortion might dip in response to pressure, but it would not stop. Women would once again besiege physicians and other healthcare workers with requests for abortion. Enforcement of new criminal statutes would no doubt be patterned on the old system. State authorities would again expect medical personnel to assist the state by reporting, interrogating, and physically examining women suspected of having abortions. Police would revive the practice of raiding abortionists' offices and capturing women. Any woman who miscarried would be treated as a potential criminal and subjected to medical examination, which would include internal viewing via ultrasound. Medical mistreatment of women would become routinized as the healthcare system became further enmeshed in the state's law enforcement apparatus. If abortion is made illegal, some women will die. Many more will be injured. The old abortion wards will have to be reopened, a public health disaster recreated, making abortion hard to obtain, will not return to the United States to an imagined time of virginal brides and stable families. It will return to us in the time of crowded septic abortion wards, avoidable deaths, and the routinization of punitive treatment of women by state authorities and their surrogates. Abortion has always been a part of life, and unless we find a way to take care of women, it always will be. If you really truly want to get rid of abortion, then find ways to take care of women so that they don't need abortions. That's all for today. Until next time, live your life.